When I was growing up, I enjoyed watching The Adventures of Superman, strange visitor from another planet who came to Earth with powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal men. One of the episodes that I remember involved an elderly man named Professor Periwinkle, whom Superman had come to know as someone always inventing things, but who could rarely control his inventions. The professor would always tell Superman what his inventions should be used for and what it should not be used for. It's that little caveat that the professor told Superman, the intention of what something should be used for, where I want to begin this narrative about the history of intelligence. The philosopher, essayist, and poet George Santayana famously said, "Those who do not remember their past are sure to repeat it." And when it comes to the history of intelligence, especially here in the United States, nothing could have been said more appropriately. So what is intelligence? How is it measured? I once heard a simple answer to these two questions. Intelligence is what intelligence tests measure. Some have it, and some don't. Over time, there have been forces converging that have supported the development and understanding of intelligence as a fixed, innate, measurable, and deterministic entity. In other words, a fixed mindset about the capacity of someone to learn, versus a growth mindset which believes that learning is incremental. In our society, we have come to think of intelligence as an entity which can be quantified in a single test score. So where did all this begin? I'm going to reference a summary of chapters 5 and 6 from a book by Stephen Jay Gould entitled The Mismeasure of Man to describe and share with you the history of intelligence in the United States. The first intelligence test was created by Alfred Binet in 1904. Except Binet's test was not intended to be an intelligence test. He was commissioned by the French Ministry of Public Education to develop techniques for identifying children who might need special education services due to a lack of success in school. His test was administered individually, which involved many different activities of increasing difficulty. Binet was very concerned that the tests should not be misused, just like Professor Periwinkle. Binet believed that intelligence was too complex to capture with a single number. In fact, he declined to divine and speculate on the meaning of each score, which later would be called IQ. He also feared that the use of his test would lead to the inappropriate labeling of children, and thus a self-fulfilling prophecy about their academic achievement. Binet stated, quote, "They, the schoolmasters, seem to reason that this is an excellent opportunity for getting rid of all the children who trouble us, designating them as unruly or disinterested in school," unquote. Additionally, Binet identified three cardinal principles that should govern the use of his test. First, the scores should be seen as a practical device which do not define anything innate or permanent. Second, the test should not be used as a general device for ranking all students, but rather be used for the limited purpose of identifying children whose poor performance might indicate a need for special education. Today, these children might be said to be learning disabled. And third, the aim of the testing should be to identify children in order to help them improve, not to place labels on them, which in and of itself becomes limiting. However, all of these three principles that Binet established were disregarded when his test was imported to the United States. The misuse of Binet's test is related to two ideas which were actively embraced at the time in the United States by American psychologists. The first is reification, the assumption that test scores represent a single measurable thing called IQ. The second is hereditarianism, the assumption that intelligence was largely inherited and that inherited IQ scores marked people and groups for their station in life. It is important to note that this hereditarian theory of IQ is a homegrown United States product, which developed largely at a time of extreme nationalism in the early 20th century, fueled by fears of a rising tide of cheap labor immigrating from Southern and Eastern Europe. During this time, there were three pioneers of hereditarianism in America, the first of which was Henry Goddard. According to Goddard, there were three categories of mental deficiency: idiots, imbeciles, and feeble-minded. Idiots and imbeciles were easy to identify. Today, these people would be considered severely or moderately limited in intellectual understanding, emotional development, and academic progress. Those who could not develop full speech with a mental age below 3 were idiots, while those between ages 3 and 7 who could not master written language were imbeciles. Goddard, himself influenced by hereditarianism, was worried about identifying those who were, in his word, quote, high-grade defectives, unquote, the feeble-minded, who could function in society and were a threat to the gene pool of American intelligence. So, he became the first popularizer of the Binet scale in America for the purpose of identifying the feeble-minded, whom he also referred to as morons. He considered the test as a measure of a single innate entity, IQ. Goddard began testing immigrants at Ellis Island, and he hired testers who were instructed to pick out the feeble-minded by sight. Curiously enough, the people whom he determined best at this work were women, who, according to Goddard, seemed to have closer observation than men. Among those tested, 83% of Jews, 80% of Hungarians, 79% of Italians, and 87% of Russians were determined to be feeble-minded or morons. Surprised by these results, he concluded that, quote, they do a great deal of work that no one else will do, that includes an immense amount of drudgery, for which we do not wish to pay enough to secure more intelligent workers. It is possible that the moron has his place, unquote. Goddard introduced Binet's scale to the United States, but it was Lewis Terman who became the primary architect of its popularity. Terman, a hereditarian and professor at Stanford University, created what is today known as the Stanford Binet, the model for virtually all IQ tests that followed. And like Goddard, Terman was concerned about identifying and labeling the feeble-minded or morons who he believed were the source of many social problems. In a 1916 book entitled The Measurement of Intelligence, Terman writes, quote, not all criminals are feeble-minded, but all feeble-minded persons are at least potential criminals, unquote. He would advocate for universal testing as a way of spotting the potential criminals before it was too late. He dismissed the role of environment in testing, saying, quote, the children of successful and cultured parents test higher than children from wretched and ignorant homes for the simple reason that their heredity is better, unquote. Terman would later recant this statement. The IQ test came of age during World War I, when Robert Yerkes developed the Army Mental Test, the first mass-administered intelligence test designed to screen Army recruits to determine their appropriate assignments. It was given to 1.75 million recruits. Like his predecessors, Yerkes believed in the hereditability of IQ, even though his data suggested otherwise. For example, he continually found a relationship between intelligence and the amount of schooling a person had. However, he did not conclude that schooling led to increased scores, but rather argued that men with more innate intelligence spent more time in school. Additionally, when blacks from the North did better on the test than Southern whites, he did not conclude that it had to do with better access to education in the North. Instead, he argued that only the best Negroes had been smart enough to move north. Finally, when immigrant populations did better on the tests the longer they had been in the United States, he did not conclude that it was the result of new learning, but rather that only the more recent immigrants came from a more efficient gene pool than those who had come earlier. Yerke's data, combined with the nationalism and ethnocentrism of the times, resulted in the 1924 Restriction Act, which limited immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. The hereditary bias of Gardner, Terman, and Yerkes blinded them to interpretations of their data, which made more sense than the ones they relied upon. Hereditarian assumptions are one problem with the American understanding of intelligence. Reification, the assumption that test scores represent a single thing measured by a single number, IQ, is the other. The official psychologist of the London public schools in 1937 was Sir Cyril Birch. He wrote that this single number, IQ, which was central and all-pervading, shows a further characteristic disclosed by the testing. It appears to be inherited, or at least inborn. Birch's name would become an important one in this history of intelligence and the story of intelligence in the United States, because he published influential studies of identical twins raised apart. If, he argued, intelligence is determined by heredity and not environment, then identical twins raised in different environments should still have similar IQs. And Burt provided data that demonstrated exactly that. However, after his death in 1976, it was discovered he had completely fabricated his data. It was totally unreliable. His fabrications, believed to have begun in the 1940s, went undiscovered, and he was still publishing articles in prestigious psychological journals into the 1970s. In a 1969 controversial article published by the Harvard Educational Review entitled, "How Much Can We Boost IQ and Scholastic Achievement?" Arthur Jensen argued against compensatory education programs such as Head Start because he claimed that IQ was an inherited and fixed ability. And he based his argument on the data of Cyril Birch, the same data that would soon be discredited. In the 1994 book entitled The Bell Curve, Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein make the same arguments that Jensen had made, which was rooted in the intellectual history of hereditarians Gardner, Terman, and Yerkes, and couched in the work of Cyril Birch. Those who do not remember their past are sure to repeat it. What do all of these have in common, besides bad science? The first group was working in the early part of the 20th century at the height of an influx of Eastern and Southern Europeans, many of whom were supportive of labor unions. Jensen was writing at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, and the bell curve came along at a time of economic slowdown. All represent backlash against progressive movements, essentially arguing for support of the status quo and couched in a hereditarian argument. If these views of intelligence that represent a fixed mindset are problematic, what other views that represent a growth mindset are there to offer a different perspective? Howard Gardner is well known for his views on multiple intelligences. Even before him, there was Piaget, who defined intelligence as an ongoing process of adaptation, not a fixed trait. Finally, Stanford University professor Carol Dweck has written extensively about a growth mindset where learning is an incremental and lifelong process. I always remember and believe that smart is something that you earn, not something that you are. And I adopt a growth mindset that says, if you think you can and you work hard, you will get better. If you have the confidence and make an effective effort, you will get smart.